Let's take a live update now from Bharat Mandapam, the venue of the G20 Leaders Summit, where all the action is happening. Where the opening statement was also made by the Prime Minister of India and also Bharat. And our colleagues Shubhendu Ghosh and Sakal
Bhatt are standing by there to take this show further. So Sakal and Shubhendu, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Amrit and Munmun. Welcome back once again to the venue of the G20, our special presentation where we're getting you all the action. What a big start the G20 engagement has been off to. Right in the beginning, Prime Minister's address of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he talks about the permanent membership of the African Union. That's the big news coming in from here at G20. Prime Minister talks about trust deficit and how to deal with it in the global economic and world order. We'll talk about all of that. I'm Shubhendu with my colleague Sakal.
And the biggest story or the big headline as of now that comes from India's New Delhi, the presidency, India's G20 presidency is now African Union, the inclusion of African Union in G20 scheme of things. Definitely India's big G20 moment plus a big diplomatic win. So from next year onwards is going to be G21, and for that the world is going to remember India's G20 presidency. Let me quickly, in fact, Shubhendu, once again introduce our special guests in the studio, rather our colleagues. Olly Barratt, thank you very much for joining. Olly Barratt, senior journalist, DD India, and also Sreeram Chaulia, author, scholar, expert in international affairs. Olly, I'll give it to you first. So this again is historical.
Yeah, that's a big moment. The G20 becoming G21. As Ali Assoumani welcomed up to the top table, we saw that.
Did you see that hug?
We saw that hug. We saw that embrace. So I think that's an acceptance of that invitation. That's going to be one of the pictures of the day, certainly. And as you were saying, it also means that within half an hour or so of the G20 Summit getting underway here in New Delhi, we have something for India to point to as an achievement. It was much trailed, this idea of the AU joining the G20, but it took some diplomacy to get it over the line, and it looks like we are there. So yeah, we have that first big moment of the G20 already.
Sreeram.
Well, 1.4 billion people of Africa deserve this place at the table, and they've been given the table thanks to Indian leadership, Indian persuasion, Indian diplomacy. We have been able to, cut through the ice. They were saying that there are some other groupings that will also object to this and will also, if African Union, why not us, that kind of thing. But, we've been able to overcome all those and get consensus. This is the beginning of the historic presidency of the summit, because one after the other, we're going to see more and more deliverables. This is one big concrete deliverable right at the outset. We came prepared, we got the consensus, and we started with a bang.
Right, and as we get closer to the final outcome of the G20, this is the Leader Summit, 2 days of Leader Summit. Olly, the G20 India's presidency started with the focus on the Global South. There was a Global South conference. There were deliberations on the manner in which the perspective, the priorities, the aspirations of Global South are going to be given center stage. This inclusion of African Union successfully, an announcement right at the beginning, is a big takeaway of what India has achieved for the Global South in this edition.
I think that's right, and I think it also shows India in the light that it wants to be shown at this summit, which is showing leadership for developing nations, the Global South as well, as you mentioned. We also heard from the Prime Minister at the top of his speech a tribute to Morocco and the earthquake that's taken place. So he did start there, and of course Morocco is a member of the African Union, and we've heard several other leaders talking about that already since they've been here, and I think that just shows one of the ways in which the AU can be welcomed into this grouping is by some of those leaders paying tributes to what's happened in Morocco with that earthquake.
What does this really mean for the 50+ countries of the African Union, and how does it also change the broader narrative of the G20 nations? Now that you had European Union, your European Commission, and now you have African Union. And do you think this consensus building could have been a tightrope for India or a challenge?
Sakal, 55 countries, African Union is comprehensive regional organization, includes all the member states of the African continent. Apart from them, I mean, South Africa is already a individual as a country, a member of the G20. Nigeria, another big African country, has been an invitee country. But for the whole union to get here, I think it symbolizes also that it's their rise,
their representation.
And the average age in Africa is 19 years. They've got the potential for tremendous growth. It's already a major economic partner with most trading powers around the world, including India. We are doing almost 100 billion trade with the African continent, and that's no less than the European Union for us, So in that sense, this is huge. And I think they will be forever grateful to India, because we are the ones who pushed and got this through, They've been wanting to be here, and they deserve to have the place. So I think for people of Africa, it's a day to celebrate, because finally the so-called marginalized or downtrodden of the planet are getting a seat at the high table. Prime Minister, when he used the gavel and called to attention, and then when the Foreign Minister went and brought the African Union chair and made him sit in the front row, along with those visuals, people of Africa are going to remember.
There's a larger message there.
Because, see, for centuries of colonial exploitation, racism, slavery, they've come out of all that. There are still challenges in the African continent. We're supporting them, but giving them the dignity and the place.
Yes, the common civilizational link, history that India and Africa shared. We were covering the BRICS summit, where we were also talking about how Mahatma Gandhi and his legacy also connects India with South Africa. Celebration of that civilizational link in that hug that Prime Minister gives to the representative of the African Union, that becomes symbolically very, very significant, isn't it?
Yeah, our development partnership on the African continent is very strong. We do a lot of human resource capacity building, to a lesser extent physical infrastructure. Our telemedicine, tele-education, these are huge successes, the Pan-African e-network. And we are building major strategic partnerships, especially with countries which are along the Indian Ocean coast, on the eastern coast of Africa. Right. So I think they are all, going to look to this as a moment where they were allowed, their voice finally came through, because, they were like the voiceless. And so when we say voice of the global south, we have now delivered on it in such a concrete way. And in fact, they don't need an intermediary anymore now. Right. Because once they are full members, they speak for themselves. And that is Indian foreign policy, is always to empower our partners so they speak for themselves and represent themselves. They don't need anybody else to be seconding for them.
Olly, collectively, what does it mean for the global south when Africa, with 1.3, 1.4 billion people finding a voice on the global high table, more developing emerging economies finding a voice of their own? What does it mean for the collective of the global south?
Well, certainly from an economic perspective, it just brings more countries into the fold via that membership of the AU, now effectively getting a representative voice at the table here at the G20, the G21. That's right, and in economic terms, it adds hugely more economic heft to this grouping, a grouping that was born out of really finance and economic cooperation and all of that. There's just more economies at the table now having their representation through the African Union. So I think that's an important part of it as well. And the AU, as you say, it wanted to be here, it wanted a voice, and it also represents the further move away in some of these groupings from Western dominance. The African Union now with that seat at the table, as we were saying earlier, with India wanting to represent the global south in that way.
The economic aspect, since we are talking about it, now we do know that we also have the representatives from the African Union Development Agency, and we do know that one of the larger agendas also includes increase in loans from the multilateral agencies for lower economy groups and developing nations. And I think that really makes more sense now because this is also one of the major agendas in this 18th G20 Summit. Right?
Absolutely.
I mean, it makes sense now.
Yeah, debt, the issue of debt is, we have brought it to the center stage. Since the pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war, the kind of insolvency and financial collapses we are seeing, especially in least developed countries, is just like 9 pins falling one after the other. And to arrest that, that we need some kind of an agreement at G20 level on debt. And the Africans in particular have been very, very insistent that there must be restructuring in a fair and equitable manner. So now that they have a seat, they can actually vote on these issues.
In fact, restructuring of the entire debt architecture is something that also has been extensively discussed in as a run-up to the G20 summit this time around.
Sakal, the discussion format, the decision-making structure of G20 is based on consensus, right? Negative consensus. Even if one member says no, you can't get a declaration, you can't get an outcome. African Union now actually has a say to on these points which matter most to those 1.4 billion people they represent, and for them to say no on debt, for example, on climate, on trade, on all these fundamental developmental issues, this gives them the chance to really fight for their rights. Earlier they were like outside the room.
No representation.
Right. Olly, if you can see it in sequence of the big events that have happened in the past weeks, again, I'm going to refer to the BRICS, which this year became from 5 to 11 nations, 6 new nations, developing emerging economies getting a voice. Now in G20, African Union comes in, 55 countries of the emerging world find a voice. When Prime Minister speaks about the issue of trust deficit in the global order, is he also showing the way how to fix it? You give representation, you give voice to the people who have been for so long not represented by themselves.
And it's interesting because events like this are often criticized for being a talking shop, that you don't get anything done. But when you actually talk to individual delegations who attend events like this, they'll say, actually, we do get quite a lot done. And it's not just about the final declaration and things we can all agree around the table. It's about some of those bilateral meetings off to the side. Just to take one example, the UK and Singapore have announced a deal overnight, a new strategic partnership. It's just one example of how there are lots of meetings that will take place at this summit, which now include the African Union as an incoming member of the G20. So it's an illustration, really, I think, in the way that you can bring other voices, other groupings into these wider organizations, and in buildings like this and that one over the road, leaders and delegations certainly feel they can get things done.
Right, and Professor Chaulia, when the BRICS reform happened, it was said that it's sending out a message to the world out there that multilateral reforms are need of the hour and we can do it. Now this reform at G20, that voice, that push is getting louder, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's the time for the South to rise, and we have been, the sense of solidarity has always been there. There was something called the G77. It's still there in the UN General Assembly. More than 120 countries are part of it now. And India has always been an integral part of G77. But there was always this perception that somehow, they talk about justice, they talk about equity, they talk about fairness and to make a better and a more democratic world order, but the hypocrisy remains in terms of the real players and the ones who are controlling the show. So there's a lot of resentment in Africa against big powers, and they think that they have always been trampled upon and exploited and neglected. So now what India has done is turned it around, because think about it diplomatically. If India as the host is proposing AU membership, can any one of the G20 members dare, with a conscience, say no to it? If they say no to it, they lose access to the African market. They're going to really struggle there, and they'll be painted as villains, and they cannot afford it because Africa is rising. They need the access to the minerals and to the raw materials and to the rising middle class in Africa, which is 400-500 million people. So I think what we are seeing is we have played our hands very smartly. We told them, all the G20 members, vote with a conscience on this matter, because if you say no and try to block this, the wrath of Africa is going to be on you,
Yes.
So these things matter in diplomacy, and I think they all heard it. They all are very wary of being seen as somehow blocking Africa. If you're blocking Africa, you're blocking 1/4 of humanity,
Future.
I think India put across that kind of viewpoint and turned it around,
Turn it around, and can we also then, in that sense, definitely is being looked at as a big diplomatic win under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
This is one of the many.
Yes, and the whole aspect of human-centric approach that India has been hammering under its presidency, one of the cornerstones. The whole aspect of calling it People's Summit, by the way, Prime Minister in his speech also did mention, that is also something which we've not seen in earlier summits.
And also, Sakal, I saw Prime Minister mentioning a Sanskrit saying about the need for unity and to work for the well-being of everybody, And I think that was his opening call to remind all the G20 members that they must behave responsibly. And here, this is not the table to do individual slugfests. Rather, think about the big picture. The whole world is watching us. We are, carrying the aspirations of the whole world on our shoulders. So it was kind of like a statesman-like opening speech that elevated the level of the discourse to another, sphere altogether. And he's saying, here we are. Okay, every country has national interest. Every country comes in with its bargaining positions and points and all that. All that horse trading will happen. But remember one thing, at the back of your mind, it should be one earth, one family, future, and one future.
Yes, yeah. And that point, what was the underlying message when Prime Minister talked about bridging the trust deficit?
See, look, for weeks now, they have been haggling over the declaration. I'm sure many would have been, contesting this point or the other. It will go down to the wire as always. These days, the summits are all like that. 11th hour, finally there is agreement. So what he's basically saying is preparing the leaders to say we all have to make compromises. We all have to make compromises for the sake of a global good, This is not a race where a zero-sum game where I win and you lose. We have to create some kind of a win-win logic for 20 and 21 from now on.
Olly, you want to add to that?
Well, I mean, just to say that this is clearly a diplomatic win to start the summit, but there's a huge diplomatic challenge to come over the next 24 hours or so. Can they reach a final declaration, or will issues like Ukraine get in the way? So yes, we've started with India being able to register a win, but there's a difficult period of a day or so ahead. Yeah.
The challenge, but would you like to, that's a very interesting point. Olly,
diplomacy, they always find a workaround with wording. One or two paragraphs, one or two sentences, one country or two or three or a group of countries may say we don't like this. We will have to find a language. The basic language of G20 will be in English, and then it will be translated in other language. So I think English has sufficient breadth to be able to satisfy different needs and different parties, and we will find consensus. There's just no question. Whoever tries to sabotage this is going to be sidelined, and the costs of sabotage are very high. So I think I'm optimistic that India has it worked out.
But do you think this must have actually come up more often, or maybe not at all too much in the entire run-up, whatever deliberations and consultations the G20 members have had till this stage, Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Well, yeah, the differences are very stark. But think about this. India is has partnerships both with Western countries and with Russia. And I think we are going to be leveraging all those strategic partnerships to be able to cut across to all sides. And so there's that bilateral chemistry we spoke about that is going to come in. And a lot of the persuasion is on that basis too. The host has certain prerogatives, and we're going to use those.
Yes, so as a host, do you think India has been able to navigate its way? Because if you remember, there was this also parallel narrative that maybe some countries will try to persuade Indian leadership, to persuade Russia that the war should end, whereas India's position on this has been absolutely neutral in the sense that India is taking its own side. We are leaving none behind when it comes to war, but we stand with peace. Sreeram?
Yes, and also, Sakal, I think what we are trying to impress upon the G20 members is this is primarily a global economic forum. Let's focus on those issues and deliver on a developmental agenda. Geopolitical rivalries can exist, but those are not within the mandate or the remit of the G20. Let's not even bring those to the table. Ideally, we should not even bring them to the table. But of course, countries being countries, international politics being international politics, it will happen. But still, I think the fact that we are trying to depoliticize a lot of these issues will make a difference, because food, digital public goods, environmental sustainability, energy, fertilizer, agriculture, cyber security, these should be depoliticized. These are not issues where they should be kind of like a boxing match between countries. Yes. Rather, we should all be holding hands and doing this.
Yes, and Olly, quoting from Prime Minister's address, when he underlines the words which have become so common to use together, food, fertilizer, fuel, it sort of defines the key economic and even socio-political challenges that the world is facing today. When he underlines those, what is the manner in which the G20 deliberations from here on the next couple of days, also going to focus on these key issues. How have they defined the past few months and years of geopolitics?
Well, Rishi Sunak, the UK Prime Minister, has come into this summit pointing to exactly those issues and saying that they are being made worse, some of the problems around them, by the conflict in Ukraine, and particularly the Black Sea grain deals. So you, in a way, can't separate those issues, and that will lead to some awkward conversations, I'm sure, around the table. But at the same time, there has certainly been a series of G20 events leading up to this point, hosted by India, that will have avoided the issue of Ukraine entirely and will have focused on other things. And India has made a big deal out of all of these various different ministerial level meetings up to now, and making sure that they've received huge amounts of attention and focus in a way that we haven't seen in many previous G20 hosting years. And so, in a sense, you can sometimes have conversations that don't include some of those difficult topics, but sometimes it's unavoidable.
This development agenda that India has been trying to push, I mean, Prime Minister Modi earlier, we know, in conversation with the Russian president, has spoken about how this is not the era of war.
Yeah.
And then he takes forward the G20 development agenda, mentions those words, fuel, fertilizer, and food. How is he taking that agenda forward in no unclear terms here?
See, I think at the level of the working groups and the ministerials, we have seen that we have tried to steer the discussion away from these controversial geopolitical tussles and to focus on the issue area. G20 is a cluster of several technical issue areas, and on each of them, our researchers and secretariat, the ones who prepare the materials, our experts on each of these domains, have really come so thoroughly prepared with so many backgrounders and proposals and ideas. Actually, the idea is to inundate these member countries, the visitors, as the host, with so much technical stuff that they have to pore over the text and actually work hard day in and out about, does it match my interest, does it not match my interest. So I think we've kept them very busy, and we've been very, very like hard taskmasters as a host in that sense, not leaving any room for sidetracking and to going in other directions. And so, of course, even the ministerials, we could not issue joint communiques at the end of them because of these sticking points. But the point is, if you are coming for something on, digital education, let's say using digital tools to enhance educational access to the poor, what does it have to do with the Ukraine war?
Yeah.
So what we're trying to do is still create that. I know Olly is right that, they're all interconnected, and the G20 last year also, in the final declaration, they did mention that the, geopolitical conflicts and wars do reduce the chances of G20 delivering on its economic agenda. But then the idea is that there is a UN Security Council. There's, other mechanisms which are able to, there's the Minsk process and all those things in Europe, right? Those are the ones actually meant to resolve the ongoing war and the conflict. G20 can call for, end to hostilities and diplomacy. I'm sure we'll see something about diplomacy. End of the day, no matter what side you are on, everybody says every war ends through diplomacy. The question is about timing. The Western countries and Ukraine are saying we will only do diplomacy after we regain our territory. The Russians are saying we are ready for diplomacy now because they are controlling Ukrainian territory. But I think everybody will be on the same page that diplomacy is needed, right? And I think that is enough of a signal that the G20 wants diplomacy to succeed. We don't want fighting.
You talked about UN Security Council. In fact, just quoting the Secretary General, in fact, he did press one of the bigger takeaways of his address day before yesterday was reform in the UNSC. But I would want to just take our focus once again back to Prime Minister's, address. Very inclusive, precise, but that is something which also Sreeram set the agenda under India's presidency, where Prime Minister again quoted "Sabka Saath, Sabka Vishwas, Sabka Prayas," "Sabka Saath, Sabka Vishwas, Sabka Prayas." And the larger message. He did the specific mention of bridging the trust deficit and moving on, laying the larger vision for the global south.
Yeah, Vishwas, the term, trust. Is something, I think Prime Minister's diplomacy, not even G20, but generally even with bilaterals, he is a great believer in that. Personal chemistry also says with his peers, like presidents and prime ministers of other countries, he says that he does it so that there is a strong, the roots of the relationship are deep into the soil based on Vishwas. And then, we'll have a flowering tree. coming out of it. So I think it's very important. He has done that both at bilateral, multilateral. It's his style. And our overall approach under Dr. Jaishankar's leadership has also been that, to build deep bonds of trust so that when it comes to asking for a favor, we will ask for a favor. When it comes to applying pressure, we will apply pressure. When it comes to, coaxing somebody, we're going to use all these things. Because that comes out of trust and vishwas. If you don't have that, they're not going to care for you. All these countries say, well, what is India? So only when India comes as a credible interlocutor, as a credible host, then only we can build upon this vishwas or trust. And I think we have done that through a track record. So we are coming in here with a track record, not just a domestic governance, that is there, but also in international diplomacy, we have a track record that's going to help us pass the finishing line.
Ollie, you want to add to that?
Well, one thing just I think to note is that almost every country that's here, every grouping that's here wants to woo India because of its hugely growing economy. And so from a British perspective, for example, Rishi Sunak wants to get a trade deal out of India.
The talk
exactly, and that's going to be discussed in their bilateral for sure. But it does mean that the UK is going to be well disposed towards, for example, finding a declaration at the end of the summit. They want to help. They want to help India be able to point to a diplomatic success here. And so in some ways, the environment is ripe for that declaration to be reached at the end of the weekend, not to say that it's going to be easy.
Right. Professor Chaulia, so many of the key agendas of the G20 have been laid from the perspective, the needs of the global south, which are in need of the right support and platform. Now, with the big news coming in, the inclusion of African Union as one of the members of the G20, how much of influence, negotiating part, I'll take an example of climate finance, for example. We've been negotiating with the developed world to pay for what they've done. With the voice of the developing world, global south getting stronger, how do these critical issues get addressed?
Shubhendu, let's do the number game. 20 countries, now 21, so let's say 21 delegations. 7 from the OECD, G7, and then there are 13 and now 14. So look at it as arithmetic, okay? Emerging powers and developing countries are now going to have approximately 14 voices. Middle and small powers. Richer countries and more advanced countries and big powers are going to be having 7. So you see which way the balance is tilting, right? And of course, those 7, the richer countries, like I said before, because in their rhetoric and also to some extent in their policies, for example, the European Union. The European Union, as you know, already has a permanent membership. They always say that we do things for the developing world and we are big champions of the South, right? Now it's like they have to walk the talk. And because face to face, they have to show that their commitments are real and that they're implementing the commitments. So from that point of view, the G20 dynamic is definitely going to shift. I think the weight is going to be more towards, let's say, the middle layer of developing countries, which are represented by India and all, and then the LDCs who are coming through the African Union seat. I think their voices collectively will be a big pressure group, that the richer countries cannot deny.
Absolutely, Ollie, and we know that the global institutions also who are participating in the G20, there's World Bank, there's United Nations, there are other global institutions, all of them watching this development, clearly seeing how, as it were, the tables are turning, as it were, in favor of the developing world. That will make an impact on the reforms of the multilateral institutions, financial institutions that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and I think there is some openness from the delegates that are here for that idea of reform of some of those international institutions. India's made that a priority, and I think from the perspective of the Americans and the British, there is a willingness and other European countries to take a look at that and see what can be done about it.
Because the dynamic came out with
exactly
an
right.
statement saying that we need to fund the global south better.
Exactly right, and Joe Biden saying overnight after the talks with Narendra Modi that the case for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council for India, all of these dynamics, I think you have to accept are shifting, and the inclusion of the AU is just an example of that.
All right. So I think we'll have to wrap it up as of now here from our G20 venue DD India studio setup. I'm going to briefly thank Ollie and Sreeram for the moment. We'll have to give it back to our DD News studio. It's over to you, Amrit, and
over to you.
From here.
We'll, of course, be
Well, thank you, Shubhendu and Sakal, for giving us that from the venue of the summit in capital New Delhi.